June 11th, 1937. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky sat in the basement of the Lubyanka prison, waiting for the bullet that would end his life. The Soviet Union's most brilliant military theorist, the man who had modernized the Red Army and pioneered deep battle tactics that would later defeat Nazi Germany, was about to be executed as a German spy. Tukhachevsky had never betrayed his country. He had never collaborated with Germany. He had never even considered treason against the Soviet state. His only crime was being more competent than Joseph Stalin could tolerate. Upstairs, in the NKVD interrogation rooms, 7 other Soviet marshals and generals awaited the same fate. These were the men who had built the world's largest army, developed revolutionary military doctrine, and prepared the Soviet Union for the coming war with fascism. Within hours, they would all be dead. Within 3 years, Stalin would have executed or imprisoned 75% of the Soviet officer corps, 35,000 of the most experienced military leaders in the world. The man who had warned that cadres decide everything was about to destroy the very cadres who could have decided the war. June 22nd, 1941. 4 years after the purges began, German forces crossed the Soviet border with 3 million men, 3,300 tanks, and complete tactical surprise. The Red Army collapsed so quickly that German commanders couldn't believe their intelligence reports. Entire Soviet armies disappeared within days. Military districts that should have held for weeks crumbled in hours. The Wehrmacht advanced 400 miles in the first week, the fastest conquest in military history. 3 million Soviet soldiers were captured in the first 3 months. Stalin's purges had not only weakened the Red Army, they had virtually guaranteed German victory. This is the story of how Stalin's paranoia nearly destroyed the Soviet Union, how the man who feared betrayal created the conditions for his own defeat, and how the massacre of competent generals almost handed Hitler the greatest victory in human history. The tragedy began 5 years earlier, when Stalin decided that loyalty mattered more than ability. December 1st, 1934. The assassination of Sergei Kirov in Leningrad gave Stalin the excuse he had been seeking to eliminate potential rivals within the Communist Party. But Stalin's paranoia extended far beyond politics. He suspected that military competence was itself a form of treason. The Red Army had been rebuilt after the Russian Civil War by officers who understood modern warfare better than Stalin did. Men like Tukhachevsky had studied German tactics, developed innovative strategies, and created military doctrine that challenged Stalin's primitive understanding of warfare. Stalin saw military expertise as a threat to his personal authority. Officers who questioned his strategic insights were questioning his infallibility. Generals who succeeded in spite of his interference were proving that the Soviet Union didn't need him. Most dangerously, competent military leaders enjoyed the loyalty of their troops, loyalty that Stalin feared could be turned against him if these officers ever chose to challenge his leadership. Stalin's solution was elegantly simple: eliminate every officer capable of independent thought. The purges would remove the threat of military competence by removing competent military leaders. If no one remained who understood warfare better than Stalin, then Stalin's military genius would be unquestionable. It was a perfect plan except for one detail. The Soviet Union was about to face the most professional army in the world. January 1937. The show trials began with the execution of 17 prominent party members, accused of plotting with Germany and Japan to overthrow the Soviet state. The charges were completely fabricated, but Stalin's method was clear: manufacture evidence of foreign conspiracy, then use that evidence to justify eliminating anyone who might pose a threat. The military trials would follow the same pattern. Officers would be accused of collaborating with fascist enemies, forced to confess under torture, then executed as traitors. Their deaths would demonstrate Stalin's vigilance against foreign influence while eliminating the domestic expertise that made foreign influence unnecessary. Marshal Tukhachevsky became Stalin's primary target because he represented everything Stalin feared about military competence. Tukhachevsky had revolutionized Soviet military doctrine, developed the deep battle theory that emphasized rapid advances and combined arms tactics, and trained a generation of officers in modern warfare. Most threatening of all, Tukhachevsky had been right about German intentions when Stalin had been wrong. While Stalin insisted that Hitler posed no immediate threat, Tukhachevsky had warned that Nazi Germany was preparing for a massive eastern offensive that would require the Red Army to fight a war of unprecedented scale and intensity. Stalin could not tolerate being wrong about something so important. If Tukhachevsky was right about German capabilities, then Stalin's assessment of the strategic situation was dangerously flawed. Better to eliminate Tukhachevsky than to acknowledge the error. March 1937. Stalin's agents began manufacturing evidence against the Red Army's leadership. The NKVD forged documents suggesting communication between Soviet officers and German intelligence. Interrogators extracted confessions from arrested officers that implicated their superiors in imaginary conspiracies. The fabricated evidence followed a consistent pattern. Soviet generals were allegedly selling military secrets to Germany in exchange for promises of high positions in a post-conquest puppet government. The accusations were absurd. These officers had spent their careers preparing to fight Germany, but Stalin's justice system didn't require believable evidence. What Stalin's system required was comprehensive elimination of military expertise. Every officer who understood modern warfare was by definition suspect because competence itself suggested foreign influence. How else could Soviet officers have developed advanced military knowledge except through collaboration with advanced foreign armies? The logic was circular and deadly. Competent officers must be traitors, therefore all competent officers must be eliminated. June 1937. The military purges began with the arrest of Marshal Tukhachevsky and 7 other senior commanders. Within weeks, the arrests spread throughout the Red Army like a contagion. Anyone who had worked with suspected officers became suspect themselves. Anyone who defended colleagues was accused of participating in conspiracies. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented in military history. Stalin eliminated 3 of 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 13 of 15 army commanders, 8 of 9 admirals, 50 of 57 Army Corps commanders, 154 of 186 division commanders, all 16 Army commissars, and 25 of 28 Army Corps commissars. In total, approximately 35,000 officers were executed or imprisoned, 75% of the entire Soviet officer corps above the rank of colonel. The purges didn't just remove individuals, they destroyed institutional knowledge. Officers who understood combined arms tactics, strategic planning, and modern logistics were replaced by politically reliable commanders whose primary qualification was loyalty to Stalin. The Red Army that emerged from the purges was larger than ever, but commanded by men who knew more about Communist Party doctrine than military doctrine. September 1939. The invasion of Poland provided the first test of the purged Red Army's capabilities. Soviet forces took 17 days to defeat Polish units that were already collapsing under German pressure. The performance was so poor that Stalin ordered a complete reorganization of military command structures, but reorganization couldn't restore the expertise that execution had eliminated. The officers who replaced purge victims were politically reliable, but militarily incompetent. They had been promoted for ideological conformity rather than tactical ability. Most dangerously, the surviving officers had learned that questioning Stalin's military insights was more dangerous than losing battles. Initiative and independent thinking, the hallmarks of effective military leadership, had become capital crimes. The Red Army now valued political orthodoxy over military effectiveness, party loyalty over professional competence, and Stalin's approval over battlefield success. November 1939. The Winter War against Finland exposed the full extent of damage that Stalin's purges had inflicted on Soviet military capability. Finland, with a population of 3.7 million, held off the Soviet Union, with a population of 170 million, for 105 days. Soviet forces outnumbered Finnish defenders by 3-1 in men, 30-1 in aircraft, and 100-1 in tanks. But numerical superiority couldn't compensate for the leadership vacuum that Stalin had created through systematic elimination of competent officers. Soviet attacks were poorly coordinated, logistically inadequate, and tactically primitive. Commanders who might have developed effective strategies had been executed as traitors. Officers who understood winter warfare had been replaced by political appointees who understood party theory but not battlefield realities. The Finnish army, commanded by officers trained in practical warfare rather than ideological purity, repeatedly outmaneuvered and outfought Soviet forces that should have achieved victory within days. International observers concluded that Stalin's purges had effectively destroyed Soviet military capability. Adolf Hitler, watching the Red Army's humiliation in Finland, began planning the invasion that would exploit Soviet weakness. March 1940. The Soviet Union finally defeated Finland through sheer numerical advantage, but the victory revealed more weaknesses than strengths. Soviet casualties exceeded 200,000, nearly 10 times Finnish losses. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Over 1,000 tanks destroyed, 400 aircraft shot down, and massive amounts of artillery and supplies abandoned. Most significantly, the Winter War demonstrated that political loyalty was no substitute for military competence. Stalin's politically reliable commanders had proven incapable of conducting effective operations against a vastly inferior enemy. But instead of acknowledging that the purges had weakened Soviet military capability, Stalin blamed the poor performance on insufficient political education among the troops. The solution, he decided, was more political indoctrination and stricter party control over military decision-making. The lesson Stalin drew from the Winter War was exactly wrong. Not that he needed competent military leaders, but that he needed more political control over military operations. June 1940. Germany's conquest of France in 6 weeks provided a stark contrast to the Soviet Union's difficulties in Finland. The Wehrmacht's rapid victory demonstrated the effectiveness of modern military doctrine, precisely the kind of doctrine that Tukhachevsky had developed and Stalin had destroyed along with its creator. German success validated every military innovation that Stalin's purged generals had advocated: combined arms operations, rapid advances, air-ground coordination, and flexible tactical responses to changing battlefield conditions. But Stalin couldn't acknowledge this validation without admitting that he had executed the Soviet Union's most competent military theorists. Instead, he convinced himself that German success proved nothing about Soviet weaknesses, because Germany faced only decadent Western democracies, while the Soviet Union would face different challenges. Stalin's fundamental delusion that political will could overcome military reality remained intact despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. April 1941. German forces conquered Yugoslavia and Greece in 3 weeks, demonstrating once again the effectiveness of military doctrine that the Soviet Union had possessed and Stalin had destroyed. Wehrmacht tactics continued to validate the theories of dead Soviet generals while exposing the incompetence of their replacements. Intelligence reports reaching Moscow described German preparations for a massive eastern offensive. 3 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and extensive supply preparations pointed to an invasion scheduled for summer 1941. But Stalin refused to believe intelligence that suggested he had miscalculated German intentions. Accepting the reality of German preparations would mean acknowledging that Tukhachevsky had been right about the threat while Stalin had been wrong. Instead of preparing for invasion, Stalin continued purging officers who showed too much concern about German capabilities. Warning about German strength was interpreted as defeatism, Preparing for German attack was seen as provocation. The Red Army remained unprepared for war because preparedness would have acknowledged Stalin's strategic mistakes. June 22, 1941. At 3:15 a.m., German artillery began the largest military operation in human history. 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers crossed the Soviet border on a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The invasion that Tukhachevsky had predicted and Stalin had refused to prepare for had finally begun. The Red Army's response revealed the full catastrophe of Stalin's purges. Soviet commanders trained in political orthodoxy rather than military tactics proved incapable of conducting defensive operations against professional enemy forces. Communication systems collapsed within hours as officers who might have maintained command and control had been executed years earlier. Supply networks failed because logistics specialists had been replaced by political appointees. Tactical coordination dissolved because the officers who understood combined arms warfare were dead. Most critically, surviving Soviet commanders were paralyzed by fear of making decisions that Stalin might later interpret as treason. Taking initiative had become a capital crime. Retreat was proof of collaboration with the enemy. Surrender meant execution by Soviet security forces. The Red Army didn't just lose battles, it disintegrated as a coherent fighting force. June 28, 1941. 6 days after the invasion began, German forces had advanced 280 miles and captured 150,000 Soviet prisoners. Entire Soviet armies had vanished from German intelligence maps. Military districts that should have mounted organized resistance had collapsed into scattered groups of demoralized survivors. The contrast with Finnish resistance was devastating. Finnish forces, outnumbered and outgunned, had held Soviet attacks for over 3 months. Soviet forces, with numerical superiority and defensive advantages, were collapsing after less than a week against German assault. The difference was leadership. Finnish officers understood warfare. Soviet officers understood politics. Finnish commanders made tactical decisions based on military reality. Soviet commanders made decisions based on what they thought Stalin wanted to hear. Stalin's purges had not just eliminated individuals, they had eliminated the military culture that made effective resistance possible. July 15, 1941. German forces reached Smolensk, 400 miles inside Soviet territory, having captured over 600,000 Soviet prisoners and destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft. The Wehrmacht was advancing faster than German logistics could support, covering more ground in 3 weeks than any army in history. Stalin's response to military disaster was characteristically paranoid. More purges. Officers who lost battles were executed as traitors. Commanders who retreated were shot as cowards. Generals who requested reinforcements were accused of defeatism. The message to surviving Soviet officers was clear. Death in hopeless attacks was preferable to survival through tactical withdrawal. Better to die fighting impossible battles than live to be accused of treason. This approach guaranteed that the Red Army would continue losing battles, but it also guaranteed that Stalin would never have to acknowledge that his purges had caused the disasters. October 1941. The Battle of Moscow began with German forces positioned just 20 miles from the Kremlin. Soviet resistance was finally beginning to stiffen, but only because Stalin had been forced to recall officers from prison camps and remote assignments to replace the commanders who had been killed in the summer fighting. Many of the officers who saved Moscow were men who had survived Stalin's purges through luck, political connections, or imprisonment that kept them away from the initial German onslaught. They represented the remnants of professional military competence that Stalin had tried to eliminate. The irony was devastating. Stalin was saved by the very expertise he had attempted to destroy. The officers who understood warfare well enough to stop the Wehrmacht were exactly the kind of competent professionals that Stalin's purges had targeted. Moscow held because some military knowledge had survived Stalin's paranoia, not because his paranoia had been justified. December 1941. The Soviet winter offensive that drove German forces back from Moscow was planned and executed by officers who had somehow survived the purges or been recalled from disgrace. General Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the counter-offensive, had been demoted and transferred to remote commands during the purge years because his competence made Stalin suspicious. The success of competent officers in defending Moscow proved that military expertise, not political loyalty, determined battlefield outcomes. But Stalin couldn't acknowledge this lesson without admitting that his purges had been a catastrophic mistake. Instead, Stalin convinced himself that the Moscow victory vindicated his leadership rather than demonstrating the value of the military expertise he had tried to eliminate. The cognitive dissonance was complete. Stalin interpreted success achieved despite his policies as evidence that his policies were correct. May 1942. The Kharkov offensive demonstrated that Stalin still hadn't learned the lessons of his own destructive policies. Despite the evidence from Moscow that competent generals achieved better results than political appointees, Stalin continued to prioritize ideological reliability over military capability. The Kharkov attack, planned by Stalin personally and executed by politically reliable commanders, resulted in the encirclement and destruction of 3 Soviet armies, over 240,000 casualties, caused by the same combination of political interference and military incompetence that had characterized the initial German invasion. Stalin's response was to blame the defeat on insufficient political education rather than inadequate military leadership. The purges had taught him to see military failure as evidence of treason rather than incompetence, and incompetence as evidence of insufficient loyalty rather than inadequate training. The pattern was self-reinforcing. Military disasters led to more political control, which led to more military disasters, which justified even more political control. August 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad began with German forces advancing toward the city that bore Stalin's name. The irony was profound. German success was enabled by military doctrine that Soviet generals had developed before Stalin killed them, while Soviet resistance depended on officers who had survived Stalin's attempts to eliminate military expertise. The Red Army was finally beginning to fight effectively, but only because desperate circumstances had forced Stalin to rely on competent commanders rather than politically reliable incompetence. Generals like Vasily Chuikov and Alexander Rodimtsev succeeded at Stalingrad because they understood warfare, not because they understood Marxist theory. Stalin's contribution to victory at Stalingrad was largely negative. He interfered less with military decision-making because the political stakes were so high that even he recognized the need for professional competence. February 1943. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of Germany's strategic defeat, but it also marked the final vindication of everything Stalin's purges had tried to destroy. The officers who encircled the German Sixth Army used tactics developed by Tukhachevsky and other executed generals. Deep battle doctrine, combined arms operations, and rapid exploitation of tactical success, all the military innovations that Stalin had associated with treason, proved essential for defeating the Wehrmacht. The ultimate irony was that Soviet victory required implementing the strategic vision of the very officers Stalin had executed for allegedly collaborating with Germany. Tukhachevsky's military theories, suppressed as treasonous, became the foundation for German defeat. Stalin had killed the generals who could have prevented the initial disasters, then been saved by survivors who used the dead men's ideas to achieve final victory. May 1945. The German surrender in Berlin was accepted by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the few competent Soviet commanders to survive Stalin's purges, through a combination of political luck and battlefield success. The Red Army that captured Berlin bore no resemblance to the force that had collapsed in 1941. But the transformation had come at an enormous cost. Soviet casualties in the Great Patriotic War exceeded 27 million people, losses that might have been reduced by millions if Stalin hadn't destroyed the military leadership that could have conducted more effective defensive operations from the beginning. The purges hadn't prevented Soviet victory, but they had made victory far more expensive than necessary. Competent military leadership might have stopped the Wehrmacht at the border. Instead, German forces advanced to Moscow before encountering effective resistance. Stalin's paranoia had nearly cost the Soviet Union its existence, and definitely cost it millions of lives that competent military leadership might have saved. The final accounting was devastating. Stalin's fear of military competence had created the conditions for military disaster, and only the remnants of the competence he had tried to eliminate had saved him from the consequences of his own policies. The generals he had killed as traitors had been patriots. The military doctrine he had suppressed as treasonous had been prescient. The expertise he had eliminated as dangerous had been essential. Stalin's purges represented the triumph of paranoia over pragmatism, ideology over expertise, and political control over military effectiveness. They demonstrated that fear of betrayal could create the very conditions that made betrayal unnecessary. In the end, Stalin's massacre of his generals had nearly handed Hitler the greatest victory in human history. Only the courage of ordinary Soviet soldiers and the competence of surviving officers had prevented Stalin's paranoia from becoming Germany's triumph. The 27 million Soviet citizens who died in the Great Patriotic War paid the price for Stalin's inability to distinguish between loyalty and competence, between expertise and treason, between military capability and political threat. Their sacrifice achieved victory despite Stalin's policies, not because of them. The Soviet Union was saved by the very military professionalism that Stalin had tried to destroy, a professionalism that survived in spite of the purges, not because of them. The massacre that nearly lost Russia served as history's most devastating example of how paranoid leadership could create the very disasters it sought to prevent. Stalin's fear of competent generals had nearly made competent generals irrelevant by handing victory to Germany without a fight. It was a lesson in the cost of choosing loyalty over ability, political orthodoxy over military effectiveness, and paranoid control over professional competence. The lesson was written in the blood of 27 million Soviet citizens who died because their leader feared betrayal more than defeat.